Welcome, everybody. Glad you can join us this evening. And we're happy to have Dr. David Chen from Christianacare here to present about the hospital-based violence intervention program, which Dave and I have been working and talking together for a couple of years, hoping to make it a reality. The program was supposed to have launched last spring, and then COVID happened. In fact, Dr. Chen was very involved in the COVID response, leading some of the key things, and worked for how many days straight, David? I'll let you do that when you come on. But fortunately, the hospital-based violence intervention program has just had its official, I guess, relaunch or launch, if you want to call it that. So we're going to learn all about that tonight. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. I'm just having a moment thinking about this past year and all that has gone on and all that it has meant in a lot of ways. I have a couple of thoughts that I'd like to share here, and I understand this is recorded, so some of these things we can talk online here and some of these things offline. I also recognize that this is part of work through the church, and I identify as a Christian myself and have thought, at least what I like to think is deeply about this from a faith-based perspective. And so this is a different presentation, Lynn, than I think you've probably ever heard me speak of before, because I do want to open this with a very frank conversation and discussion about the theological and the faith-based implications from what it is that I think we share in terms of a common source, talking about who Jesus Christ is and what the relationship that we understand violence in Scripture as well as in community, and then how that directly relates then to what we observe today. And I hope to draw clear lines. And so what I will start with saying is in this first section here, and let me begin to share my slides and such. Are these visible here? Yeah. So what I hope to start with here is talking explicitly about this violence in Christianity and the associated disclaimers that what I'm saying here in this part one is purely my own thoughts, philosophy, faith, and does not represent my employer, any affiliated organizations, anything like that whatsoever. This is just me talking about these things as I've experienced and as I've really meditated on for a long time now. And I say this because as some context and way of introduction, so I grew up in the suburbs of New Jersey. I moved to Delaware for my residency training. I did a dual certification in internal medicine and pediatrics. And I also have a background in public health. Going even further back than that, I studied electrical engineering, so kind of an eclectic mix of different things. But one thing that I felt very compelled by was this question that Jesus asks, or really a statement that he makes in response to the question. And the question being is, who is my neighbor, right? And I think those of us familiar with where that question comes from, Jesus launches into the parable of the Good Samaritan in response to that question, who is my neighbor? But for me, that was a deeply personal question that I could not shake this feeling that I did not really understand it. And I did not want to miss where Jesus was in answering that question. And so during my residency training here in Delaware, I spent 2.5 years living on the north side of Wilmington. And so for those of you that are familiar with the city, this was by 23rd and Pine Street. So a very hard neighborhood for people to live in. And one major component of that was violence that was there locally. And it was these massively disruptive incidents that would happen, unfortunately, frequently in that neighborhood, such that in my 2.5 years there are 2 instances where people were shot right outside the door, and I ended up actually holding pressure on wounds for people. And fortunately, both of them survived. But to talk to my neighbors, to talk to the children that were there, and to experience for myself that kind of terror, that kind of abnormalness to life and to community that people on the outside looking in assume becomes normal because of its frequency, yet nobody really thinks of as normal, even who experience it regularly. To me, that has been and continues to be something that I cannot shake. Every time I hear fireworks, I still jump a bit, I still freeze. And again, I was only there for 2.5 years. I don't live in that neighborhood now. I live in Trolley Square, so just a couple blocks from where the church is that we are virtually, I think, speaking at right now. And but it is still part of the same city. And I suppose that's part of the reason why you're here tonight listening to this, is because we recognize that these are our neighborhoods, right? That we fundamentally respond to the same call and that same question. And so when I want to pose this question, what is the Christological, what is the Christ-centered approach to violence? Like what does that mean for the Christian community to relate to people who identify as victims and people who identify as perpetrators? What does it mean as it relates to systems and structures that we all live in and are part of? And what does it mean for us all to be in that same kind of community, right? To not think of different communities, but to say we are under the umbrella of the same community, even if we don't cross paths terribly often. What are the influences of these different things, such as cultural norms, big quote unquote there, on violence, and what is the community's relationship to those who are both victims and perpetrators? And so how do we define violence according to the World Health Organization, which I think people have paid a lot more attention to the past year? They define violence as the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. On the conjoined side of that, the question is, how do you define justice? Not so easy. I don't think the World Health Organization has that definition as readily available. But I want you to think about how you define justice in its varied contexts. And I want to take that lens and look at this narrative from Genesis, right? Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. And I'll read through it fairly quickly. Now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hands. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And so some observations from this passage, which is the first homicide right, in scripture, in human history from this narrative. So God actually warns Cain in anticipation of what is about to happen. This crime occurs in a physical space and a location. Cain himself makes a rational decision to attack, right? There is a premeditated component to what is going on in this instance. God hears the grievance of the victim and is both witness and also judge at the same time. God actually has this dialogue with Cain in which he inquires at the same time that he accuses. And how Cain denies his guilt is by denying his fundamental brotherhood to Abel. Furthermore, Cain responds to the inquiry that God has in this dialogue, and he acknowledges the offense. The punishment for Cain is related to the crime and is effectively exclusion from brotherhood and community, and it is the hostility of the environment itself that's manifested. God himself hears Cain's response to punishment and actually shows mercy to the perpetrator here, to the murderer, and shields the murderer from further harm, and guarantees that with his own threat of force as a way of ensuring that justice. And I walk through this because, again, it's the first homicide, and it is this remarkable thing for me to have read and to see God treating Cain with some element of mercy, and then actually ending this by guaranteeing Cain's safety, even though Cain was the one that murdered Abel. Right? And when we talk about justice, and when it is often quoted within, I will say this, the Christian circles and interpretation and things like that I've heard of, oftentimes reference is made to Old Testament, law from Moses and so on and so forth. But I rarely hear this talked about when we talk about violence from a biblical, from a Christian perspective. And so again, just wanted to make a set of observations here to tuck in the back of your mind as we then talk about modern day observations on violence and the way that it disrupts community. In addition, I would like us to contrast this narrative here from Cain and Abel with that between Jesus and Pilate, right? Fast forwarding thousands of years in the future. And so this excerpt from John, I think 15 or 16, and then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. And then it goes on to describe how Pilate essentially hands Jesus over for crucifixion. So some observations here, John 18 and 19. The crucifixion of Jesus is violence, and it is injustice, right, in the biblical framework and context. Right? What's notable here is that the Pharisees as described in this passage, they appeal to the judicial system and use it as the mechanism with which to visit violence upon Jesus and to actually result in his execution. So it is the use of structures to carry out physical violence and death, a murder, if you will. It occurs in this physical context here, and it too is steeped in cultural norms, actually even more so than going back to Cain and Abel, when you could argue there weren't enough people there for really culture to be in the same way. What's notable is that Jesus himself presents no defense to these charges that are brought to him by Pilate and others. Pilate acknowledges this arbitrary nature to human justice, and Jesus establishes the power of truth as superior to that of the power of violence. Jesus makes a number of other observations and acknowledgments, but we see here a very meticulous intentionality in the execution of violence and in execution itself. And what's most notable here to me in reading this is that Jesus, who himself alone has the divine right to force, to the appropriate ordained use of violence, does not use it. He lays that down explicitly and becomes the victim. And there's so much here from a theological perspective to dive into. It certainly exceeds the bounds of our conversation here. But again, I want you to consider these questions when we approach the topic of violence from a faith perspective. Should justice be blind? Should it be individualized? Is violence the consequence of rational behavior? And what's the difference here between divine justice and what human justice is, right? How do we understand the principles that are presented here, both by human nature, but also by how Jesus is treated and how God himself interacts with humanity in these two different narratives here? So there's a whole lot there. I'm just going to leave that and then completely flip over and to do a much more occupationally focused thing. So part 2, violence and health. So some disclaimers and affiliations. This is the part where I am representing the healthcare system, and this does not necessarily relate to anything that I had been talking about all the way up until now. In my mind, it's consistent, but this is now essentially a more academic as well as a clinically focused view of violence as it relates to health. These are a bunch of the different things that I do, and kind of going back to Lynn's note earlier about COVID, I was an interim medical director for one of the COVID units. I had been taking care of COVID patients throughout the year from literally a year ago, right, today, through to now. And I'm going to mention that because when I was in the hospital, when I'm on the COVID floors, and particularly in those early days, walking down the hallway, I felt this very eerie sense that I had felt before. And I was trying to put my finger on it. I was like, what is this feeling that I have now? This unsettledness. And I realized it was the same feeling I felt when I was living on Pine Street, when I was in an environment where I didn't know if I was safe, where I felt as if my own home, my own community, the people I cared about, the place that I had my natural rhythm and spaces completely disrupted by this force, this threat that I could not see, and was disrupting everything it was that I had trusted and I had innately come to rely on for comfort, for companionship, to do my work, and that I found my identity in. And so that disruption from COVID, I have said, and I will always say, reminds me very much of what the impact of violence in communities that experience it chronically is like. So if you can draw on some of your own experiences in terms of that isolation, in terms of that fear, in terms of that deep terror that you may feel at times as it relates to COVID, and say, what would it be like if I felt that and it was inescapable? What would it be like if I felt like that and there was no vaccine? And it killed all these people in my family. And we could not escape. I ask you, consider that. And so when we talk about violence, there's so many layers to it, right? And so some of them are all the way on the state organized sorts of things. Genocide itself is the most extreme example of it. And then it goes all the way down to the individual basis, things that occur often completely privately within the home. And so there's almost a continuum to violence as we make different typologies in describing it. And I say this because violence itself is heterogeneous. And so when people talk about violence, and specifically firearm violence, we must be very careful to parse out exactly which groups of people it affects and how it affects them, right? And so if I were to ask you, what is the most common mechanism by which firearms cause death in the United States? Perhaps you may think of mass shootings. Perhaps you may think about homicide that occurs on the street, in the home, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And the answer is the most common mechanism for firearm-related death in the United States is suicide, right? And we don't often typically think about it in that way, but that is the reality of it, right? And mass shootings make up, as of 2017, less than 0.3%, right, of firearm-related deaths in the United States. Now, I would argue 0.3 is a lot, but still, it's not the majority, a far cry from that. And so again, firearm violence is very heterogeneous. And so we need to be very careful about what we're talking about when we do talk about it. Moreover, it's heterogeneous by sex or gender. It's heterogeneous by ethnicity. It is heterogeneous by race. It is heterogeneous by geography and by age, right? And you can see here in just very kind of plain patterns, differences. And what I would say, things that stand out is, one, homicide is primarily something that affects younger people, specifically younger men, though not exclusively men. It is something that we see the greatest disparity here among those that identify as Black. And by contrast, if we look at suicide, that is something that tends to be that which affects those that are older, and cumulatively and increasingly so with age, and something that perhaps affects women more, or on a more similar scale, I would say, to men, and that affects, as a disparity, the white population more so than others. Some of these things and these trends change over time, but what's really remarkable, if we want to talk about changes in time, is how static deaths from firearms are in the United States. It has likely risen in the past couple of years, but it's not actually too far off as a raw percentage of the population as compared to decades ago. Why then does it seem more pervasive or prevalent? And part of it is because of the decline in deaths from other sorts of essentially injuries. So you see motor vehicle accidents used to have perhaps double the rate of deaths per population in the United States, but that has declined because of different safety features that have been implemented in cars, different rules, different regulations, different policy changes that have really aggressively tried to reduce that. So why are firearms different? Why are they sticky in a sort of different way? And so what I would argue is, in addition to violence being a public safety issue, that it is in fact a public health issue. This seems obvious. A famous quote by former director of the CDC, David Chen, he would say, if firearm violence is not a health problem, then why are all these people dying from it, right? It's kind of like this obvious statement there. But what's remarkable here is the American College of Surgeons. And let me just tell you as a clinician, if a surgeon says something, they really mean it, right? And so the American College of Surgeons, the Committee on Trauma said, quote, "Violent intentional injury is the most poorly addressed public health problem in America, period." Right. Moreover, there is a marked disparity in how this mechanism of death occurs in America, right? And so Patrick Sharkey, whom I'll reference later, in this sort of demographic review, said that there had been a decline in homicides going on over a span of a couple of decades, and that decline, if it was applied universally across different demographics, specifically African-American men, accounts for 17% of the life expectancy gap between Black men and white men. In a book that he wrote expanding on this, he goes further to say, this is such a profound difference in life expectancy that if you think about obesity and the amount of life expectancy change that it makes in people, it's nearly the same. And part of that is because of that disproportionate effect on those that are younger in the population, and particularly young men. Unfortunately, the gains in the reduction of homicide over the past several decades were not seen unilaterally. They were not distributed equally or equitably among different populations. And so this was an article by Dr. Papachristos, who is a leader in the field of understanding violence and social network analysis, things like that. And in this paper, they found that in Chicago neighborhoods, that the reduction in crime, and specifically homicide, was disproportionately felt, where homicides decreased more in neighborhoods that were already safe, relatively safe. And it did not decrease as much, if at all, in the neighborhoods that had traditionally, in the study, already been exposed to high rates of community violence. So we see that there is a stickiness to violence in geographic communities, and that unfortunately translates oftentimes into a lack of progress or gains where they may be felt elsewhere, right? So kind of thinking back to the difference between motor vehicle accidents and firearm deaths from injuries, you saw how one group of injured people benefited and that had a reduction in fatality over time as compared to the other. You can imagine a similar sort of disparity occurring here, right? Where one population or group benefits over time in a way that another group does not. What are some of the ripple effects that are triggered by public exposure to violence? This was an analysis by the Urban Institute, and they tried to quantify how firearm-related homicide and even just the sound of gunshots had an impact on growth rates related to business and retail and home value and things like that. And they found a number of cities in which it had a notable negative impact that they felt was convincingly displayed over time. Now, a kind of caveat to that is this didn't happen in all the cities, and not all of these effects happened in all of the cities. But where it did happen, it was remarkable, it was statistically significant, and it seemed to be temporally and causally related. I mean, it happened in time, right? There was a surge in violence, and then there was a clear chilling effect on these sort of community factors. And I say all these things to lead to this point here, what is called the simplified framework of community violence as proposed by Professor Abt, who I very much agree with because he presents a very compelling case. And what his sort of typology, if you will, that's described here as a framework is that when you boil it down, community violence, meaning violence that happens kind of in public, not related to intimate partner violence, but something that is observable and that is felt throughout a community. Community violence happens at the intersection of three sticky things, right? Violence tends to be sticky towards specific individuals, and this needs to be clarified, and I will try to do that at length later. It tends to be sticky in particular places, and it tends to be sticky as related to particular behaviors. Now, I need to be very careful in describing all three of these because we immediately can launch into these conclusions about what it means to have sticky behaviors or sticky people, sticky places, right? This is not meant to be pejorative, but merely to say that there are observations as to predictability of how violence follows things. and how that can be observed and even intervened on. And when I say that to mean that, and this may be very controversial what I'm about to put out there, but I think it's supported by the evidence. And when you talk to people and dive into it, it makes sense. Violence is not something that is entirely predicted by poverty, right? And poverty plays a role, but it is not entirely predictable. And the reason for this is very simple. 90% of the people, right, who are in poverty are not at all involved with violence, period, right? Yet they suffer by the association with it, and they also suffer from the effects of it themselves, right? And so just kind of putting that out there as an example of, there are a lot of things that can have an impact or have a relationship to these sticky areas, these sticky domains, people, behaviors, and places. And there are interventions that can address those things. But what APT here proposes, and what I think is increasingly recognized, is you must be very focused and very careful in how you apply an analysis and approach to these things. And so what do I mean by that? So let's say you have chest pain and you end up in the emergency department tonight, God forbid, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, no, doctor runs in, does an EKG, says, oh my gosh, you're having a heart attack. You need to go to the cath lab right now to get a stent, pop that artery open, and save whatever tissue is left in your heart. Is that the time for the doctor to say, now let's sit down and talk about your diet and your exercise regimen? How many fruits and vegetables do you eat a day? Well, why don't you write out for me in a nice diagram here what your eating patterns and behaviors are? No, right? Literally what we call door to balloon time. As soon as you hit the door, a timer goes off, and it's the hospital's responsibility to get you into that cath lab within 90 minutes, gold standard of care, right? 90 minutes is better spent moving you into the cath lab than it is doing a detailed review of your diet and history. Is diet and history important? Absolutely, 100%. But in that moment, what is going to have the biggest impact on your mortality, literally your mortality, is getting to that cath lab and getting that artery open. Right? And so what APT proposes that there are stratifications in terms of the prevention as well as the interventions that we deliver when we think about violence. And so when someone comes in bleeding, the first thing to do is to stop the bleeding and not to sit there and do this necessarily detailed historical review of all of the factors that led into it. There is a time, there's a place for that to happen, absolutely. But at that moment, first thing to do is to stop the bleed. And that's literally the name of his book, Bleeding Out, that kind of goes into this in more detail. And what he puts out here as a model, right, is when we talk about public health, we talk about primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention. Primary prevention is stopping something before it occurs. Secondary prevention is essentially, on a narrow perspective, mitigating that impact. And then tertiary prevention is effectively treating the impact once it's already occurred, and then minimizing ongoing damage related to it, right? And so primary prevention is kind of broad, is for everybody. Secondary prevention is for those that have kind of risk factors, but haven't quite yet arrived at that point of injury or harm. And then tertiary prevention is treating it after that kind of happens. So he says, think about violence in that same way, right? Primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention, but he modifies this very traditional healthcare, public health approach to say there is also rehabilitation and then active suppression that is unique to violence as compared to other public health approaches for other illnesses or conditions that affect people, because it by nature involves the public safety and the justice system, right? And so, when we say suppression, that's policing, and say rehabilitation, hopefully that means the way that the incarceral system and rehabilitation system is supposed to function. And so what he did was he went through hundreds, I think it was thousands of studies and papers, read through all of them and said, what does the evidence actually suggest as being effective in looking at these sticky things, places, people, and behaviors that tend to have recurrent patterns of violence or predictable patterns of violence? And what are the different ways in which we can address this from a primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention, suppression, rehabilitation lens. His focus has primarily been as it relates to policing, and so does not dig into healthcare as much. And I promise, get there eventually. But I say this to set up that context because these two are intertwined, right? They cannot be understood apart from one another. And so what he says here are, okay, here is what studies on these different interventions and domains have generally suggested as being effective or mixed effect. So here, things are highlighted and italicized as being either modest, mixed, null, or negative. I think it's a little bit unfair here because you're kind of putting the things that really could have benefit and perhaps were not narrow enough or done in a specific way that would have shown that benefit, mixed together with those that are clearly negative. I'll point some of those out. Scared straight is either no effect or very negative effect, right, in terms of programs. But street worker programs, it's more mixed, generally leaning towards positive in the net effect from it, right? And so just to kind of interpret this slide with a bit more nuance than is this kind of presented here. Same thing with community policing. There's more, I think, mixed evidence for that, depending. Gun buybacks really either null or no effect or negative effect. I don't know about negative effect, but really null effect. Gang prevention is not really well described here, and so I kind of hesitate to comment on that further. But the things that do work, that have been demonstrated to be effective, are some of these surprising, right? So alcohol regulation, right? And it's like, well, why is that? Well, alcohol decreases inhibition, right? And so if alcohol is involved, violent crime is more likely to occur, both firearm related as well as blunt injury or stabbing assault related, right? CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is mainly looking at those who already have either committed or been victims of violence, and using cognitive behavioral therapy to essentially help some with PTSD and symptoms, emotional regulation, and some also with other different behaviors that can be mitigated for those that are negative, and that can be reinforced for those that are more positive. And so you can kind of see here, again, the heterogeneity, right, to violence. It affects different things in different ways. Therefore, solutions need to be tailored for different people in different ways. The right thing for the right person at the right time and the right place, right? And so I want you to keep this in mind when you hear these conversations about violence, because the most common error I hear is that people talk about one domain and then they kind of use the argument and they drag it over to another domain where it is either untested or actually completely inapplicable. But then they use that as rhetoric in either a political or a policy or just a personal argument, and then it goes awry. So this has been very helpful in terms of being able to stratify a framework to say, well, what does the evidence so far show and suggest as to what is effective and what are things that are not quite so clear as to what's effective? So I say this to kind of set up then what does it mean for Wilmington and for us specifically. And we talk about sticky places. When we talk about shootings in Wilmington, it's very clear that they are sticky to certain neighborhoods. They happen more often on a given block than another different geographic block, even of the same density within the city, right? And so what does that mean and why is that the case? There's a whole variety of things, but we recognize, again, it's sticky in geographic location, places. We notice that there are seasonal patterns to it. So this is literally a decade of shooting incidents. I extracted this myself from the news journal, and this is by month over time. Red is essentially homicides, blue is shootings, and these are just incidents, and some of these have actually multiple victims in a given incident. But you can see this cyclical nature based on the season, right? Usually worse in the summertime, usually not as bad in the wintertime. Well, why is that? Behaviors. People are less out and about in the wintertime as during the summertime, right? There's less than vulnerability from an injury perspective, where you need to have literal line of sight to injure someone by shooting them or attacking them directly. But then also, this may relate to the way that people socialize and the way that people have the opportunity to have conflict or have the opportunity to essentially be harmed. Then there are the people themselves, right? And so the People's Report, which was done by Dr. Yasser Payne's group at the University of Delaware, they did this community survey in Wilmington. And there were a lot of questions that they asked looking at structural violence and crime. But what was really notable, and this was in the Southbridge neighborhood primarily, they asked this question: have you ever had a relative killed with a gun? And the majority of people said yes. Have you ever had a friend killed with a gun? And the majority of people said yes. So you see these dense associations in exposure to violence. It doesn't mean that everyone who has had a relative killed with a gun, or everyone who's had a friend killed with a gun, is themselves going to be a perpetrator. In fact, it's not very indicative of someone being a perpetrator because it's so common in these geographic neighborhoods and areas, right? So again, when we say sticky people, it needs to be kind of clarified further. And so the CDC in 2015 came in and did this report where they found essentially, they went through a list and said, okay, who was convicted of a firearm related offense. They went back in time, 6 months worth of data looking at all these different domains: social service information, healthcare information, school information, justice system, so on and so forth, and said, could we predict, based on these different factors, who was likely to be involved in committing a firearm related crime within the next 6 months? So they look at the age here, and surprised? Are you surprised at looking at this age demographic based on what we talked about? No, right? Because this reflects the pattern that we already know related to firearm injury, right? We've been talking about firearm injury up until now, right? But you see here, this is a study looking at risk of firearm perpetration, right? Or related crime. So you can already say, from an age perspective, there's likely a correlation. There's a relationship that's here, right? Then they dug further, right? And they said, well, of the group of people that were going to essentially go on to commit a firearm-related offense, what were these things that we picked up in historical review of their records from these different domains? Were they in the emergency department in the past for one of these related things? So prior injury from a violent assault of some sort or something involving the police. Were they unemployed? Did they have a history of potentially maltreatment as a child? Perhaps you're familiar with the adverse childhood events, or ACEs. Were they ever in probation or incarcerated? Is there history of truancy from school, unexcused absences, or prior expulsion? And if you look here, so these are percentages, right? High percentage had social assistance program receipt previously, right? More than half had truancy within the year before this incident. Half had been on community probation through the juvenile system at some point. Very few had had a gunshot wound previously, only 13%. But when they actually did the multinomial logistic regression, right, to see what was the specificity, meaning how well did one of these incidents predict whether something in the future would happen, it was different, right? So this is a point score, higher meaning more likely, for each of these different things. And what they found was the things that were most predictive was being in the emergency department before for something, right? Again, it's a very small fraction of those that did. So this does not capture the entire population that would go on, right, to be involved with a firearm-related crime. But compared to those who had been recipient of social assistance programs ever, you see that that point value score is only 7, relatively speaking, right, as compared to 12 for someone who had been shot or stabbed previously. And so it shows that just because something happens frequently or commonly does not necessarily mean that it is predictive of, in this specific instance, being related to a firearm-related crime. So I also need to be be careful talking about, again, perpetrator as compared to victim. They're related, not always, not 100%. So I'm going to shift back to talking about those who are victimized, right? And this was a really interesting study that came out actually not that long ago. And what they did was they looked at people who had been injured. So these are trauma surgeons, right? And they said, okay, for people that had this injury severity score, as they call it, is one way of coding trauma. If they were injured in a motor vehicle accident and they were injured by a firearm with the same severity score, what were their outcomes 6 months to a year afterwards, right? And you would expect if the same physical bodily injury happened, then perhaps the outcomes would be the same. And what they found was that wasn't the case in terms of how the patients reported how they were doing at 6 months or 12 months afterwards. Those who had been injured by firearms said they were more likely to have chronic pain than those that were injured by the same amount of severity in a motor vehicle crash. Same thing for PTSD, almost double the odds ratio, as it's called. Worse quality of life from a physical perspective as well as a mental health perspective. So there's a differential impact on people's health based on the mechanism of injury, right? And we might intuitively understand this when we talk about PTSD, right? The intent matters, right? Being targeted intentionally matters, perhaps more than something that may be more accidental. But do we recognize that in how we deliver care? And the answer is not really, or at least not traditionally, right? And so this is where the HVIP concept is really birthed from, is recognizing that the mechanism matters. It has a direct impact on these measurable outcomes for patients moving ahead in time. Perpetration aside, not the consideration here. Victimization alone being indicative related to mechanism injury of these poor outcomes, right? And so this CDC report, again, done in 2015, focused on those who would eventually commit firearm crime. One hypothesis is that perpetration may be an expression of inadequate treatment of existing injury, right, such as for PTSD, right? And to maybe put it in a more intuitive way of saying it, if somebody shot you and you showed up in the hospital, the police came and interviewed you, and 85% of the time, no one was arrested after having shot you. How safe would you feel walking out the door of that hospital? How safe would you feel if you know someone who had been killed and you were the friend of that person in the hospital, or you were a proxy to that incident? How likely are you, if you had a suspicion as to who might have been involved in literally trying to kill you, knowing that that person would likely 85% of the time not be arrested even, much less charged, might you be inclined to take that justice upon yourself, right? So again, just putting that out there as a hypothetical consideration. In reality, the arrest rate in Wilmington for firearm injuries has varied over the years. It's been better in the past couple of years, but it's still less than 50%. So the HVIP program, or Hospital Violence Intervention Program, is focused not on perpetration-related stuff, right? We are focused on those that are already victimized. These are already our patients coming in through the doors of our emergency departments who are admitted to the hospital. And how do we stabilize and treat the ongoing trauma related to that injury, and perhaps even prevent future re-injury from occurring? And so the program design very basically is there's an injury that occurs, they're hospitalized in the first iteration of this program. And then during that hospitalization, there's a teachable moment, meaning that there's a time in which we can work with the individual in terms of being able to get the nerves, stabilized, for lack of a better descriptor, to help make sense of and understand what had happened, to begin to do what we call safety planning, right? To assess whether there is a safe place they can go to after discharge, how they feel safe, whether those feelings of a lack of safety may be contributing to, say, avoiding things that could be helpful to them. As one example, in listening to other programs, some people said that their patients were afraid to ride the bus because it was a kind of a public space and they weren't sure if someone was going to try and target them as they're getting on and off the bus, right? And we know that some shootings of adolescents have happened in Wilmington at bus stops, right? And so being able to explore those concerns, and then being able to, for those that are at high risk for either being lost to medical care, not being able to, even saying that's kind of pejorative, right? Being lost to medical care, not being able to get the medical care that they need. How can we help to bridge those gaps? And by doing that, stabilization, again, reduce the risk of future re-injury. There have been some studies looking at hospital violence intervention programs that show a reduction by 20, maybe even 50% in some of them of future re-injury within the next 5 years, which sounds great, but there are also some other studies that suggest that someone who came in for firearm-related injury, their risk of being dead in the next 5 years, right now taking someone that's in their 20s, right? Dead in the next 5 years is perhaps 20, if not 40% from a repeat injury. It varies by state, it varies by location. But if I told you, you went to the hospital with that kind of crushing chest pain, and on discharge, I told you, hey, you know what? There's a 20%, 40% chance that you're going to be dead in 5 years from the same thing happening. You would say, give me a different doctor, right? So again, recognizing this as a disparity in what healthcare is available and delivered to the patient, and trying to mitigate disparity in those outcomes for them moving forward and looking in the future. Some of the key principles related to this is not only engaging people there in the moment on the spot at the bedside, but also having what's called a credible messenger, someone that relates to them and understands their experience and is able to speak into that and to build that trust to be able to help navigate all of those things that we were just talking about in terms of access to care and other resources to stabilize and to give them the best opportunity for recovery. That is the key crux to this program, right? Everything, I will be plain, has been built around the support and the launch of the credible messenger. In our program, these are what we call community health workers. So people who, again, come from the neighborhood, who come from a similar experience to those at the bedside, and being able to help gain trust that we as a medical system have often lost historically over decades of time with those who are in communities that are heavily affected by violence. And again, focusing on patients that are victims of violence. So I'm going to point to some resources here and then kind of pause for questions, and then perhaps we can stop recording in a minute. I'll just kind of talk about each of these to give some context. So Patrick Sharkey was the demographer who wrote this really great kind of overview of a lot of the history and policy as it relates to violence, its impact in the cities in particular, and the different influences there, and perhaps some of the different pathways out of those problems. Professor Abt, who had come up with those frameworks and that kind of rephrasing of the public health model to integrate both public health and public safety into a way of approaching and reducing firearm violence in particular. Wrong Place, Wrong Time, which is by Dr. Rich, who was one of the founders of HVIP's Hospital Violence Intervention Programs. This is perhaps my favorite book of these four, because he writes this very candid description of his conversations at the bedside with these young Black men as a Black doctor himself, and the comparisons to how the system in which he lives and works in, meaning the healthcare system, isn't always aligned, or at least historically wasn't always aligned with really addressing those deep disparities and inequities, straight up racism as applied to these young men. And he walks through a number of different personal relationships and experiences as a doctor to this. And then Focused Deterrence by Professor David Kennedy. I mention this because it is a policing strategy for trying to reduce firearm violence. It is heavily referenced in Professor App's book on Bleeding Out, and in that framework mentioned before. There was just a paper review that came out a week or two ago, citing yet again the high quality research evidence that continues to support focused deterrence as being effective in reducing firearm violence when implemented well and when funded for success. And that's a whole nother discussion. I'm not going to really dive into that because that's not my domain of expertise. But if you want to know more, because it has been deployed and is active in the city of Wilmington over the past 1.5 to 2 years, that's a resource for you there. So I'm just going to pause there. I actually made it under time, and ask for questions. And if we could just kind of pause the recording.